Hi, I'm Jeremiah Sheppard, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to give my testimony today. Having the chance to do this is kind of a small victory for me because many wasted years of my life were spent in shame and hiding and really being afraid to be really known by people. And the journey from where I was then to where I'm at now is definitely not a testament about how great I am, like not at all, but I think absolutely shows the greatness and kindness of God. So the reason I say that is because my life is one that has involved sexual addiction to a level that honestly I shouldn't even be sitting here right now. I have never suffered from alcoholism. I was never into drugs. I didn't get into gambling or any of the other vices that could have entrapped me. But as far as my sexual behavior, except for God, my life could have gone very, very differently. And for the things that He's delivered me from, He deserves to get the glory. And so I will share some of what my life has looked like. So to start at the beginning, I was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1978. I never knew my father, or as I affectionately refer to him, the cowardly sperm donor. He left when my mother was 3 months pregnant with me, and I've never had so much as a phone call or a birthday card or anything from him. Now, on the one hand, in my mind, I always thought, like, good freaking riddance. If that's the kind of man he was, to just up and leave a woman with a baby on the way, then the heck with him. But I've also come to understand that not having a father around at all was setting me up for some problems that I will detail later. I have two older half-brothers from my mother's first marriage who are 8 and 7 years older than I am. Now, I know our mother loved all three of us. I want to make it very clear from the get-go that I know that she loved us very much in her own kind of wacky, screwed-up, narcissistic way, but there was genuine love there, and I don't want to take that away from her at all with what I'm about to say. In some ways, I know my mom did the best she could with what she had, in some ways. But while there are people out there who were cut out for doing a good or at least an acceptable job of being a single parent, my mother, God rest her soul, she just was not one of those people. She just didn't have it in her. She was completely overwhelmed with trying to raise 3 boys on her own, and she didn't deal with the resentment of being in that situation very well, which I will also explain further. I was introduced to sex at age 3 by my oldest brother. In the beginning, it was him and some of his friends that did stuff to me. And after we moved away from Phoenix, it was just him by himself for a while. I don't remember how many encounters there were, but unfortunately, I do clearly remember being made to do sexual acts on them that no child should ever have to do. He finally stopped around the time I went into kindergarten, but unfortunately, my mother was also doing things to me that did not stop until I was 10 years old. For all my life, I just straight out refused to say my mother was sexually abusing me. I didn't want to go there. Because, it's not like she carried things to like actual intercourse or something, so I figured, come on, it couldn't have been that bad. But when I first started getting help from the counselor, he pointed out that if it were a father doing the things to his young daughter that my mother was making me do, there would be no question in anybody's mind that it was sexual abuse. And just because the genders were switched does not make it any more acceptable. I only know that as a young boy, having to do the things with my brother and my mom was confusing, to say the least. It was emasculating, at times it was very degrading, and the end result was my innocence was taken away and my sexuality activated way too prematurely and beyond the ability of a young child's brain to be able to deal with. Obviously, I didn't have the words at that age to convey what I was feeling, but looking back now, I can see that very early on, I started to withdraw and isolate in many ways, and that fed into my addiction in later years in the sense of feeling unable to ask for help. I remember having an unhealthy preoccupation with sex long before puberty and before that kind of curiosity would be considered normal. I started masturbation when I was 8 years old. And at that young age, I was convinced this behavior I was doing was some sort of dreadful, abnormal thing that I have to keep a secret, and I was convinced that I was the only kid on the planet doing this horrible, horrible deed. Now, of course, years later, I figured out, this is something that adolescent boys do, but at the time, I was convinced I was doing some shameful, perverted thing, but I couldn't stop. Masturbation very quickly became compulsive for me at 8. So that plus the other things happening at home caused shame and self-hatred in me that just got suffocating sometimes. But I didn't have anybody around me that I could turn to ask for help for any of this. It was a very small town we had moved to. My mother was a nurse at the local hospital, and she was very well known and well liked in that community, and she made it very clear to me on a number of occasions that I better never tell anybody anything that was going on in our house behind closed doors. Her neediness and her instability could get fairly extreme sometimes. She put a lot of pressure on me, even as a small child, to be her surrogate spouse or partner in some weird, twisted way. She was dating men who were married. She was always the other woman, and she would tell me all about the problems she was having with her boyfriends and asking me when I thought they were going to leave their wives and wanting to know what I thought she should do about her relationships. She shared details about her sex life with them that I did not need to know, like ever, let alone as a child. I can also remember her having me make phone calls to bill collectors or utility companies to negotiate to get the power turned back on because she had not paid the bill for a few months. As an adult, I understand that this kind of behavior is called emotional incest, and being expected to be her surrogate partner was completely overwhelming for me. I didn't have the ability to be and do all the things that she was demanding, but not giving her what she wanted was not an option. Sometimes her needs could take a darker turn. She was prone to rages, and while this did not happen often, when they did happen, they were pretty brutal. It was difficult for me to predict and try as best I could to stay a step ahead because things could be normal 1 minute and then turn to screaming insanity for 10 minutes and then be normal again, or as normal as things ever got in our house. There were a few occasions with black eyes or being kicked out of the house in the middle of the night and some other things, but basically it could get ugly sometimes. This combined with my oldest brother's drug addiction that started in the mid-1980s and has lasted, as far as I know anyway, for the rest of his life, made for an environment that was pretty hard to live in. When he was using, his rages were just as bad as hers, and when they would fight and go at it, it was pretty bad. And see, her fury at him was often what precipitated her then turning around and exploding at me. I had to take the brunt of the anger that she felt both at him and at her life in general. You know, I guess I never really felt like an actual person to any of them. I was just kind of an all-purpose emotional ATM, if you will. I needed to be a shoulder for her to cry on when she wanted one, and was expected to do whatever it took to make her feel better. I had to tell her how much I loved her and assure her that everything would be okay. But if she was angry or needed to get aggression out, I had to be the outlet for that too. I was a vending machine for her, expected to be of service and give or do anything, no matter what it was costing me as a little person who didn't know how to do all that. Now, please understand the point of all this isn't some pity party for myself or to make anybody feel sorry for me, okay? One thing I cannot stand is when people play the victim and whine about their lousy childhoods and use that as an excuse to be a lousy human being for the rest of their lives. Give me a break. The fact is, yeah, I could not control the environment that I was raised in, but I could control how I responded and the choices that I made later in life that are completely my responsibility. So, yeah, just please don't pity me because I don't do that. But the reason I'm explaining all of this is to help you understand that as the years developed, masturbation and later pornography and fantasy were a way of escape and a way to cope with just the craziness around me and this, this ever-increasing sense of shame and this internal pressure that was kind of building inside me. You know, masturbation was not even sexual at first, meaning I wasn't fantasizing or anything. It was just a way for self-comfort. But like I said, it became addicting and compulsive very, very quickly. I can recognize now that I lived in my head way too much. I isolated myself at school and away from my classmates and as much as I could at home. And my way of escape was, in my mind, I would just go away. And I would pretend I was the hero of whatever book I had just read or movie I had just watched, or I would make up stories of my own and live in them. And you know, I know all kids pretend and make believe. That's a normal part of childhood, but this was something I think I did beyond what was healthy. I would spend hours every day just daydreaming, pretending to be somewhere else and be somebody else. Because you see, in my mind, I could be strong and mighty and courageous, and I could overcome any obstacle, and in my boyish fantasies, nobody ever picked a fight with me without getting their butt kicked. In short, I was the opposite of what I was in real life, which was scared all the time and a tendency to just cower down and never fight back, and this only added to the shame I already felt. I was often told what a pansy I was, among other things, and the older I got, just the angrier I got at myself for not fighting back, and just letting things be done to me. But the fear was always stronger than the anger, so I cowered down and just took whatever. And the shame of feeling like the world's biggest wimp just got worse. Over time, my fantasies became less and less about being the superhero and more about sexual fantasies. I saw hardcore pornography for the first time at age 12, and here I am 30 years later, and I can still see those first images just as clearly as if I viewed them yesterday. I was completely hooked and drawn into pornography pretty much instantly. I started seeking out porn wherever I could, and while the internet in the early 90s was nothing like what it is today, there was still plenty of smut to be found if you were a computer geek like I was and knew where to look. HBO and Showtime were analog back then instead of digital, and I figured out how to unscramble them to watch the adult shows that came on in the middle of the night, and I can remember staying up sometimes until 2 a.m. watching those even if I had school the next morning. I used school computers to look up sexually explicit stories on the internet and later images and videos as they became available. I became a full-blown porn addict. But as puberty set in, I realized that I was feeling attracted more to guys than I was to girls. It might be hard to explain or understand from an adult perspective, but let me tell you, when you're 13 going on 14 and you find yourself experiencing those kinds of feelings, I can't really describe the sheer horror that I felt. I had enough self-awareness, even at that age, to realize I was pretty messed up. I knew that, but I had always, again, in my imagination that I would escape to, I'd always pictured myself married to a woman and raising a family and being an amazing dad, and even as a young preteen, I had already made a vow to myself that no child of mine was ever going to go through any of the things that I had gone through, and that I was going to be the father for my own kids that I had never had. So all that was already decided and a done deal in my mind. I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted to be normal. I wanted to grow up and get the hell out of my mother's house and away from my family and start my own life someday. I assumed that I was going to grow up to be a stable, functioning adult with a family of my own and be able to prove to the world that I wasn't just a pansy that would never amount to anything. So when I felt myself having same-sex attractions, it was like a nightmare had come to live inside me, especially as I got older and those feelings got more intense instead of going away. I didn't realize it at the time, but the damage of not having a father around to identify myself with in those early developmental years and going through the things with my mom and brother, that set the stage for some very bad choices that I ended up making. Because while in my imagination I wanted this family, the reality in real life was, being intimate with a girl just wasn't appealing to me. I was not curious about their bodies, having been seeing my mother's body for all those years and being just no. The notion of being vulnerable with a woman or emotionally intimate with a woman, let alone physically intimate, that was not just unappealing. It actually felt dangerous to me in some levels. I also around this time dedicated my life to Jesus Christ at age 13. And looking back now, I know that this was a fully sincere, heartfelt dedication. And Christ showed up that day and saved me. I can also look back now and see for years where the hand of God was protecting me, even in my worst moments. I know people from various Christian backgrounds have different opinions of how God operates in our lives, and I respect that, but this is my story, and I can't give an honest testimony without being very frank that the God of the Bible is good, and the Lord was merciful even when I chose to let my behavior get out of control. What I mean is, for all the shame and self-hatred I felt about myself in general and what my sexuality was turning into, that did not stop me from at first experimenting and then having full-on sex with other boys my age starting at 13, the same year I became a Christian. My teen years descended into a black hole of sexual promiscuity, pornography addiction, and behaviors that grew more risky and more dangerous as time went on. And through all of this, believe it or not, I was still very sincere in my faith. I still had a mental picture of the man that, I so desperately wanted to grow up to be. I believed and still believe in the Word of God as the way that we're supposed to live. So what did I do? So I went to church on Sundays and youth group on Wednesday nights, and I got very good at posing as a good Christian boy and faking it through most of the rest of my life as well. And, this double life that I started living got heavier and heavier as the years progressed. I find it kind of amusing now. Very occasionally I'll talk to somebody I went to high school with, and they'll share that back then they thought I was some goody two-shoes. They had no idea. You know, you can teach yourself to become a very talented actor, and you can look great on the outside. And maybe for a while you can fool the whole world, but laying in bed at night when it's just you and your own thoughts and you know the real truth about yourself and what you're doing, that's a hard thing to live with. So instead of trying to get better, I just kept doing the same stuff over and over, because if nothing else, the sex addiction could help me feel numb for a while and not have to think too much and not have to remember too much, and I certainly didn't want to have to feel too much. At age 17, things at home finally got so bad that I decided to take off on my own. I came to Phoenix with a whole $250 in my pocket, thinking I was going to make it on my own and start my life out. I worked at a temp agency during the day, doing bookkeeping, and worked fast food in the evenings. No car, no apartment. I ended up living in a little motel room for a few months. I would take the bus during the day and rollerblade back to my room at night, but even with all that busyness, like a good little addict, I still managed to find my way to all variety of adult venues, bars or bookstores or sex clubs. I had no business being in any of those places, but it's a funny thing, if you were young and good looking, they weren't asking for ID back then. This all led to an even worse downward spiral. I had already done a lot of things sexually that teenagers shouldn't be doing, but once I got to Phoenix, I put myself in even more dangerous situations. And only by the grace of God did I not end up, who even knows, beat up or raped or killed or arrested or catching some disease. By God's grace, my body did not get damaged, but I know that I did damage to my mind and spirit with all the things I was doing. I won't go into any graphic details, but in those 5 years from 13 to 18, and especially in those months when I was down here in Phoenix unsupervised, as far as gay sex goes, I did pretty much everything imaginable. At this point, I can say that I have never been paid for sex, but that's basically the only thing I can think of that I did not do at one time or another. After I turned 18, I was sinking fast, and I knew it. It's hard to imagine and probably absurd to say it out loud, but if an 18-year-old can feel old and tired and used up, that's how I felt. I decided to get out of Phoenix. I just wasn't making it financially for starters, but I also knew if I didn't get away, my behavior was going to get even more out of control than it already was. I was not going back to my mother's house. That wasn't even an option by that point, because by then her house had been foreclosed on and she had moved away, and that was okay with me. But I did go back to the small town I grew up in and stayed with some friends for a few weeks. I was tired. I was in such a dark fog of depression, I had no idea how I was going to get out of it. And the thought had been crossing my mind quite a few times of just ending it all. I knew how I would go about doing it, but I was afraid if I did that, then I would go to hell. But you know what? God is good. In a large series of small coincidences, all happening in just a few days, I was invited by a young couple I'd gone to church with to come and stay with them. I can't explain it all now due to time and to present it in a way that makes sense without having been there, but I can tell you with total certainty that the hand of God was pulling me out of the dumpster fire that I had made in my life. There was no other logical or even illogical explanation. The Father is good, even to the most sinful of his people. Jenny and Mark had taken me to church often when I was younger, and I think they might have had a suspicion that things at home weren't quite as cheery as was being portrayed. What was meant to be just a couple of months ended up being almost a year, and they did much more than just provide a roof over my head and help me get on my feet. There was a love there was a stability there, and there was a willingness to walk with me through all my mess and all my crap and help me start to get my head screwed on straight. I owe them an awful lot. I consider them to be my godparents, and I know I would not be here right now without them. So while I was in their home, I rededicated my life back to Christ, and I did some intense work in some Christian recovery materials, and it was life-changing. The compulsive behavior stopped. I was able to start to feel my emotions again, and I was able to walk away from all the sexual behavior. I'm talking, masturbation, everything else. It was gone. If I had stayed and continued to live out the tools that I had learned, I could have avoided what happened later, but I didn't. Eventually, I moved out of their home and away from the town I grew up in over to Lakeside, Arizona, which was about an hour away. I got a place of my own. By that point, my middle brother and his wife had really stepped in a lot of ways to help me when they could, and they helped me finance my first new car. I was working full-time, and while all this was going on, I met this beautiful young woman. I don't say beautiful only in the physical sense, even though she was, and still is. She easily could have done modeling or beauty pageants or anything she wanted, but that kind of thing was never her interest. She was a college student. She was serious about her life and her work and her goals, and very different from any of the girls I had grown up with in that other town, and completely different from my mother too, which was a very good thing in my eyes. We clicked very well personality-wise. I was very physically attracted to her. And, I never felt like that with a woman before. We started dating and just enjoyed ourselves for a while, but when things were starting to get serious between us, I did open up and tell her all about my past because I thought she had a right to know exactly what she was getting into being with me. But we both figured that if we loved each other enough, that's all that would ever matter. So after only 7 months of dating, we got married. A year later, our son came, and a year and a half later, our daughter came. We were poor as can be, but we were happy. We were lovers, we were best friends, we adored our children, and while my attractions towards my own gender occasionally flared up and irritated me more than anything, all that was completely swept away in discovering what intimacy with a woman is like, and having an emotional as well as physical connection with her when we were together in that way. That was a whole new world to me. I know for some people that might seem obvious. Hello, that's what marriage is, but that was a whole new world. I loved making love to her. I loved her body. I loved how I felt afterward, like I had shared a beautiful experience with her instead of feeling ashamed and dirty like I always did after my previous encounters in that former life. And yeah, I'll be honest, lovemaking is great. It's wonderful, as a matter of fact, but it was a lot more than that with her. It's like, for the first time in my life, I was finally able to reach outside myself and connect at a heart level with somebody. And I learned that intimacy is a lot more than just physical things. She and I were both still kids ourselves in a lot of ways, but we had something together that really made me step up as a man and start to actually live out what it means to be a husband and partner to a woman who's made in God's image in her own unique way that's completely different from mine. I learned how healthy women relate to the world around them, and to see their female differences as something to not only cherish but to protect. Now, I did that very imperfectly in the beginning, trust me on that, but I learned. And as the years progressed together, we built the foundation for what could have been a wonderful and lifelong marriage. So I thought I'd made it. I thought the life I'd always pictured was mine now, but I made 2 huge mistakes. The first one was by getting lazy and complacent and not continuing to pray and seek God every day. He had been so good to me, getting me out of the pit that I dug for myself and giving me this life that not so long ago I could never have imagined being mine. And my response was to say, gee, thanks, and then move on with life and away from him. God never fully let me go, I know that now, but he did, as he always does, respect my free will and allow me to make choices apart from him if that's what I chose to do. He was always waiting, ready and willing to forgive me and father me if I would let him, but he wasn't going to force himself on me. The second catastrophic mistake was thinking that Christian forgiveness meant just forgetting about everything from the past. Mentally put it all away behind a wall, forgive my family for the things that they had done, and just try to pretend as if none of it had ever happened. That is actually not what the Bible says about forgiveness, and neither was it a healthy choice for me to make. My relationship with my family was civil, if guarded. Again, thinking of myself as such a good, strong Christian, I thought I was handling things in a godly way. I was cordial to my mother. I never stopped her from coming by and visiting with her grandchildren as often as she wanted, although she was never allowed to be alone with them or have them at her house. She resented that deeply, but yeah, too bad. I tolerated my oldest brother coming by occasionally for my kids' birthday parties or whatever, although my wife and I both watched like a couple of hawks whenever he was around. Porn was slowly but steadily creeping back into the picture. It had nothing to do with anything my wife did or wasn't doing. It was not being unhappy in my current life, so at first I didn't even understand why I was looking at it. I confessed it to her in the beginning, and she cried a little bit, but completely forgave me, and I promised not to do it again. Well, that promise didn't even last a year, and during that time I found within myself just this anger that was slowly building up in me, for no reason that I could see. Now granted, I didn't much like my job, and the insane hours I was working and raising a family of 4 on a pretty modest salary back then was stressful, but that was no reason for just this white-hot anger that was brewing up and would erupt over the stupidest things. And usually, more often than not, my wife got the brunt of it. But overall, despite all of that, we had a happy marriage, and we had a good life together. A few years later, my mother died under, let's just say, pretty horrible circumstances. To say that there was a lot of unfinished business there would be quite an understatement, but I can't say it was just her death that was the cause of my starting to unravel. I know now that my mental wall that I built around my past was nothing more than a flimsy little cover. And when she died, it was like the final straw that made the dam burst. Everything started flooding out, and I couldn't stop it. Overnight, I turned into somebody else. I was angry all the time, literally every day for years. My wife would come to give me a hug or a kiss, and I would snap at her. I never got physically abusive towards her, but emotionally and mentally, I was an SOB to her. And in my sheer brilliance at the time, I also decided that the best way to deal with all these things was to jump headfirst all in back into pornography. It eventually got to the point that she couldn't leave for 20 minutes to go to the grocery store without me racing to the computer room to watch porn while keeping an eye on the driveway for her car. Instead of, maybe spending some time with my children, who were only 6 and 4 years old, I would put them in front of the TV so I could go watch porn instead. I miss time with my kids that I will never get back, and I hurt my wife in ways that I can't ever take back. And amazingly, for somebody who thought I was such a self-aware, intelligent person, I was in so much denial about everything that I could not see the damage I was doing. I thought our marriage problems that had cropped up were all her. I figured the porn was something I was entitled to since I was the breadwinner and I was working so hard to provide for us. They say that hindsight is 20/20, and that's very true, but at the time, I was a completely blind addict/idiot. I did not see how much damage the sexual sin that I had reopened the door to was going to end up costing. So things just continued to get worse. After a few years of this, she and I were at our breaking point. Our marriage was almost non-existent. She was starting to become angry and bitter herself, and I finally had come to terms with the fact that my behavior and life were unmanageable in every sense of the word. I also knew that I had spent years at this point running from Jesus, and while he'd let me do that until I was finally exhausting myself, he was getting tired of my nonsense and wanted me back. And I realized something else. I realized I was turning into just how the rest of my family was. A lot of times with people in recovery programs or 12-step programs or whatever, we hear about them talk about hitting rock bottom. Mine wasn't that I got caught or had some major thing happen externally. It was realizing that I was acting just like the people I always swore that I would never be like. The anger, the narcissism, all the things I despised about the family I grew up in were starting to come out in me. Now granted, I have never physically or sexually abused anybody, and I made damn sure that nobody else did anything like that to my family either. I had failed at everything else in life at that point, but at least I had been able to put a stop to that. My children have never had to know or experience any of that, thank God. But the other toxicity about my family that I always hated, here I was turning into one of them. Seeking out help took months. I was not going to go to a counselor. Nope, wasn't doing it. Well, how about a recovery program of some kind? Out of the freaking question. Me, Mr. Conservative Republican family man who was an expert at pretending to the world that I had all my stuff together, go to a group and talk to a room full of strangers about my problems? Nope, wasn't going to do that either. So after months of white-knuckling and reading self-improvement books and trying everything I could on my own to try and stop and failing every single time, I did finally go to a Christian men's group that met once a week. These were married guys who had issues with pornography and were committed to walking in purity and getting that out of their lives. I didn't say anything for the first several weeks or maybe even month that I attended this group. Basically, I sat there like a houseplant, sucking up oxygen but not doing much else, and well, actually, that's probably an unfair statement to houseplants because even they had more personality than I did at that point. I listened in amazement while these guys openly talked about their struggles and were so honest and transparent, and I could not do that. I guess I thought somehow I was going to magically absorb the healing by osmosis while never contributing or sharing anything of my own. God did ask me when I was going to finally stop hiding, stop the lying, and actually get real and honest about the things I was dealing with, and I still fought him. I figured I'd made it to the group, I was faithfully coming, showing up every Tuesday morning. That should be obedience enough, right, God? But he kept working on my stubborn heart. It still took a long time for me to open up about my struggles, and in the beginning I was very vague. They all assumed that I was a completely straight guy who had only ever had problems with pornography, but nothing else, and the reason that they thought that was because that's how I portrayed myself. I was very careful with my words and always watched how I talked about things to keep all my big, dark secrets safe. And while there was some small progress, I still inevitably found myself either back in front of a computer or, by that point, using the smartphone to watch porn or act out in some other destructive way. But God kept chipping away. I did eventually get an accountability partner that I would check in with once every week. So, week after week, this guy was fully open with me and really showed me what Christian accountability and honesty looks like. And week after week, I fed him a bunch of half-truths and omissions and general BS, to be honest. After 6 months of this, I finally told him the rest of my story and what I had struggled with in the early years and was struggling with currently. The early same-sex attraction, the teen years, the full unedited truth. Finally. It took a few more months, but one morning I told the rest of my group everything. I was fully expecting disgust and rejection, and I was prepared to be told to get the hell out of there, but instead I was treated with a whole lot of compassion. And I got to experience for the first time the love that Jesus expresses through his people. A love that could have been mine a lot sooner if I had stopped hiding in shame and guilt and self-hatred and finally trusted the Lord and trusted other people enough to let them in. You know, these guys, they didn't have the same struggles I did, and they hadn't done the things that I had done in my life, not even close. But not only did they not treat me any differently, they showed me what real Christian love and brotherhood looks like. In the years since then, I've sought out some additional help because I needed it, but for where I was at that time, meeting with those guys on Tuesday mornings was exactly what I needed, and God knew that. And that was where my healing journey really started. So for Marek and John, Jeremy and Kevin, Eric, and most especially my friend Jim, I don't know if I'll ever really be able to tell you guys and express to you how grateful I am to you, for all of you who rallied around me when I thought you had every reason to tell me to leave and not come back. Because it wasn't just that one time. To this day, I have friendships with some of these guys that I consider to be brothers at this point, and they've stuck with me through thick and thin. So to them and to my godparents, I will always be so grateful. Tuesday mornings was where my healing started, no question, but there was still a lot of inner pain and dysfunction that I needed to face, and even more so now because I wasn't using sexual acting out to numb my feelings away, but I didn't know what that was going to look like. I kind of figured that God had already been more than gracious to me, getting me free from pornography and the other behavior, so it was probably best that I settle for that and not ask for much else because I had already been given so many blessings that, quite frankly, I didn't think I deserved because of decades of my life being so out of control. But God has better plans than any of us can ever foresee in our own, especially if we will get out of our own way and get out of his way and let him work. So one morning I get a call from my friend Kevin. He tells me that his church had a couple of guest speakers that morning named Gary and Melissa Ingram, who ran some newfangled outfit I'd never heard of called Love and Truth Network. Kevin told me that I needed to get in touch with Gary because he knew that Gary would be able to help me with some of my stuff. I said, "Oh, sure, yeah, I'll do that." Click. I had no intention of doing anything of the sort. I thought it had been hard enough for me to open up to my Tuesday group. I wasn't about to open up to a whole new can of worms trying to talk to somebody I never even met before. But these friends of mine, I'm telling you, even before this phone call, my Tuesday morning brothers by this point were not letting me just hide and wallow in my shame anymore. None of them would. God brought me people who, among other things, were even more stubborn than me. So Kevin kept at me until I finally said, okay, I'll call him. So being the very brave man that I was back then, I didn't even make a call. I sent a very vaguely worded, tiny paragraph email to Love and Truth Network through their website. I figured, 6 weeks from now, I'll hear back from some staff member who will offer to send me a brochure or something, but at least I can tell my friends that I kept my word on reaching out to the ministry. So imagine my surprise when the very next morning I get an email back from Gary Ingram himself offering to get together for coffee and get more information about me to see whether or not they could offer me some help. At first I kind of panicked. I'm like, what excuse can I use to get out of this? But then I thought, you know what? Man up already. It's one meeting. I reached out to Gary, not vice versa, so the least I could do is freaking show up if he's willing to take time out of his schedule to meet with me. So we met the next day, and Gary listened very patiently while I sort of stuttered and stammered my way through my story. And what surprised me was that he didn't seem at all surprised. and he didn't tell me that he couldn't help me the way I was pretty much expecting to happen on the rare occasions I had considered trying to get help at a church or through a ministry. Instead, what he asked me to do was to commit to meeting with him weekly and to be willing to do the hard work that would be coming up to step into further healing. He explained his own history, how he and his wife founded Love and Truth Network and the work that they were doing before and that they were doing currently. And I remember at one point he mentioned that since they'd very recently relocated to Arizona from New York, that they would eventually be looking for local people to help in their ministry and maybe some local leaders. And he looked at me and said, "Who knows? You might be one of them." So I nodded my head, but inside I was thinking, no need to go any further. Obviously, this dude has no discernment whatsoever if he thinks I would ever be able to help lead anything. Well, I guess we found out who it actually was. They didn't have any discernment at that point, and I could never have imagined that eventually God would open up a door for me to be able to work full-time for this ministry and to be a small group leader. Never could have seen that coming. But that particular day when we first met, honestly, I wasn't sure if I believed Gary that change could be possible. Some of my problems seemed so entrenched that I didn't know realistically if I ever really could find freedom. But I decided that for once in my freaking life, I was going to take a chance and listen to somebody else and listen to God and see what might happen versus staying in my stupid, safe little bubble where I still thought I could control everything. So I did listen. I listened a lot. But I also finally started to share and learn to be vulnerable with people. And in the years since then, Gary and others at Love and Truth Network have helped me walk out of being so completely trapped by my past and actually start to heal and have a life without all that pain and baggage holding me back. I'm not saying I've arrived yet, not by a long shot, but now, compared to where I was 5 years ago, God is very good. That's the best thing that I can say. Our God is very good. Now, I really wish I could tell you that everything had a happy Hollywood ending and I'm completely fixed of all my issues, but no, that's not the case. My marriage is over. The divorce was finalized last May. For years, my wife was hurt by me in ways that I can't take back. And those last few years of our marriage, she became the angry, explosive spouse, just, absolutely spitting hatred at me. And unfortunately, sometimes letting her anger lash out on our kids. Our children, instead of being able to enjoy their later teen years, instead had to live with watching their mom and dad's marriage just completely implode. God has given me times of incredible healing and peace and tenderness despite everything at home becoming so volatile, but I still have an extremely selfish and cold part of me that doesn't want to ask for help when I should, doesn't want me to be brutally honest when I should, and wants to make me go back to the old ways. I can still get lazy and complacent, and I know this about myself, so I have to be very careful not to fall back into my old patterns. Because apart from God, I could be back there tomorrow. That's just the truth. I owe what I have now to God. But with all that said, having heard all this, some of you might have a question in your minds, and it's a fair question, so I'm going to address it. You might be wondering, am I telling you now that I'm gay or not? So I want to be very clear with what I'm about to say and that I'm speaking for myself. I don't claim to speak for anybody else. I don't need to worry about a few specks of sawdust in somebody else's eye when I have plenty of freaking 2x4 sticking out of my own. But I do get to speak for me. So, same-sex attraction doesn't rule over me like it used to as a young man and as a teenager, but unfortunately, it is still a reality in my life. And I pray every day that God would take this away. And maybe someday he will heal me completely, or maybe he'll bring a woman for me like he did with my first wife, who I'll be able to love even more than I did in my first marriage, or this might be something I have to deal with for the rest of my life, and I'll be alone with it till the day I die. I don't know yet what that's going to look like. But I do know that, I can assume that because this happens to be one of my struggles, and my past is really, really bad, I can assume that because of all of that this makes me less of a man, less of a believer, and of less use for Jesus, and therefore just hunker down and lead a lowly, small, mediocre life for God. That's what my shame wants me to do, and that's exactly what I did do for a lot of years. But you know what? No more. This is an inner battle that I have to fight against every day and make a decision to actually man up and rise up and live for God, but He helps me to do that. There is no such thing as a gay Christian. Now again, I'm speaking for myself here, but for me, Claiming to be a believer in Jesus, but also live out homosexuality at the same time, that can't happen. Now, to clarify, I'm not talking about the desire or temptations toward that. That's a completely separate thing. But actually indulging in the behavior while still claiming to follow Christ? And I've done my own homework. I've read and researched the teachings from certain well-known people who believe that a person can be actively gay and Christian at the same time. And I understand how they twist themselves into pretzels to try to justify how God supposedly blesses same-sex unions, or how they magically discover different meanings of the original Hebrew and Greek words of the Bible to mean something completely different than how they have been understood for thousands of years. And they'll make some impressive sounding arguments to try to come up with, or try to make the Bible say something completely different than what it clearly says in Scripture regarding this behavior. We have these liberal churches out there who call themselves affirming churches, which means that they believe that they are actually loving people by leaving them in their sin, blessing them in their sin, instead of calling them to repentance, just like every other sinner has to do, gay or not. And see, but that's their deal. Yeah, I think they're sadly mistaken and misguided, and they have a rude awakening coming to them when they have to stand before God someday. But that's their problem. I don't have to answer for them, but I do have to answer for me, and I know that I can't live out what my flesh wants me to do sometimes. I don't have the luxury, if you want to call it that, of being deceived into thinking God is going to bless my sin. The Lord drew a line in the sand with me, a line that I obviously disregarded many times and have had to suffer some horrible consequences as a result, but it's a line nonetheless that I never have been able to forget about. So I have to either choose to completely ignore what God has put in my heart or choose daily to follow Him as best I can. Now, I have had people straight up tell me that I'm completely living in denial, that I need to stop denying the obvious, I need to embrace who I really am, and that I'll be a much happier, more contented person once I stop trying to deny my real self, because God is a God of love, and He loves and accepts everybody for who they are, and probably God makes people be born that way anyway. Nonsense. Or I've been told that I need to be authentic. That's another word that comes up. That I have a responsibility to the LGBT community to live authentically and be my real self. And that all that keeps me from doing that is because I have something called internalized homophobia because of my religious guilt. I used to get really annoyed when people would say stuff like that to me, but you know what? At this stage of my life, that's completely fine. People are absolutely entitled to their own opinions, and they can judge me however they like. But I'm also entitled to my truth. And my truth is my identity is in Jesus. I am a Christian man and a forgiven, adopted son of God. Period. End of conversation. It's not my sexuality that defines me. So no, I'm not a gay Christian. I'm a Christian man made in God's image who, among many other parts of my personality and many other things in my life, happens to have this particular struggle. But I refuse to let that define all of me or take on homosexuality as some kind of identity piece when it isn't for me. So I know that was a lot, and I hope all that made sense, because that's the best way that I know how to honestly answer that question. But I do need to share with you this addiction, this sin, this idolatry, whatever term you want to use for it, it did its damnedest to cost me my marriage, my emotional health, any shred of self-respect that I might have hoped for back then, my relationship with God, but by the grace of God, this could have cost me my life, literally. The shame and really deep self-hatred I struggled with as far back as I can remember, that's gotten a lot better. But there are some days that still burns pretty badly, and I know that will be something that I will have to continue to surrender to God and let Him do His healing. Working on this testimony caused me to reflect and look back on a life that started out pretty hard through no fault of my own, but then went sideways through every fault of my own. I took a flamethrower to a blessed life and marriage, and instead of seeking healing, I spent years being a coward and hiding and letting this cancer just get bigger and bigger. And I didn't just hurt myself. I hurt those closest to me. The people who are the most blameless are the ones who have had to suffer the consequences of my selfishness, much more so than I have, especially that incredible woman who took a chance on loving me. If I had had the courage to deal with this years ago, decades ago, I might be sitting here now telling a different story. And I do have to say, these past few years, as I've been to various groups or ministry functions, I've seen a lot of younger people, I'm talking late teens or early 20s, who have had issues with porn or other sexual sin, but they're dealing with their stuff now instead of waiting till later in life like I did. And you know what? From the bottom of my heart, I think you guys out there that are doing that, you are total badasses. I wish I had had the courage at your age to do what you're doing now and deal with the stuff early on instead of waiting. And I can't tell you how much I admire you for that. So if you get nothing else out of what I've shared here, I literally beg of you, don't stop. Don't stop. Keep pressing into God. Keep walking towards sexual purity now, so in 20 years you won't be sitting here telling a story like this. But also, for the young man or the young woman out there who is struggling, you're struggling with questions or doubts about your sexuality or your gender identity, or there's some other issue that you feel like you can't tell anybody about, I get it. Believe me, I get it. I've been there. I know how hard that is to be 14, 15, 16 years old and to be wrestling internally with these problems that maybe nobody else in your life even knows about yet because you feel like you can't tell anybody. And I also know that the world we live in now wants to force you into just accepting it, embracing it as your identity. They lie to you. They say that you're born that way, or that being gay or being transgender or non-binary or whatever the case may be is completely fine in God's eyes. Taste the rainbow. Embrace your new self-identity. And there might even be parts of you that really want to believe that. Some days it seems easier to just give in instead of struggling, but inside, deep in your heart and your spirit, you know it's not right. And your real desire is to be walking in integrity before the Lord and before people. So if that's the case for anybody listening, just know that God sees the real you. And there is a better way. I promise you there's a better way. Your life does not have to be defined by your attractions or your gender struggles or by the abuse that some of you have endured. That doesn't define you either. Because it's in the areas of our deepest woundedness and dysfunction that God does his very best work. So never lose hope. Never lose hope in God, and never let anybody else besides the Lord try to tell you what your identity is. And know that there is help available out there for people who are struggling. So with all that said, for me, I now know that I have a Heavenly Father who loves me and won't leave me in a pit. I have brothers and sisters in Christ that God has brought around me. I have two men that I actually consider to be spiritual fathers to me, better fathers than my earthly father ever could have been. And I have an inner circle of very close and genuine friends. I mean, these guys are straight as an arrow, 100% heterosexual Christian dudes who know all about my past and all about my present, but for some strange reason still walk with me anyway and have become brothers to me. And I'm very grateful for them. And hopefully someday I might be able to give some help back to others who are struggling. In closing, I will say that I know my story isn't the worst there is. There are people out there, people who I know personally, but maybe even people listening right now, who have been abused in ways way, way worse than I ever was. There are people whose sexual behavior might have been worse than mine, but I do know what pain feels like. I know what shame feels like. I know what failure feels like. I know how it is to see your own reflection in the mirror and hate that person staring back at you, hating that person far more than you could hate anybody else in your life. But I've learned finally some hard truths. Despite current popular opinion in our culture, absolute truths do in fact exist, outside of our feelings, outside of whether or not we see them. The wind still blows whether we see it or not. Gravity is there, and it operates, and it doesn't really give a flip what our subjective beliefs are about it. Similarly, the absolute truth is there is a God. His Son's name is Jesus, and he loves each and every one of us with a love that we cannot even imagine. There is no addict too far gone. There is no behavior too extreme. There is no situation we put ourselves in that puts us beyond the reach of his love, if we're willing to receive it. That is the truth. Another truth I'm learning is that freedom is possible and change is possible. Now, healing in some ways may be a lifelong journey, and that's okay, but it can be done. The truth is that none of us are an island. We need people around us to walk that journey with us. And the truth is our lives can be better. We can have a life in Jesus, not just an existence defined by our addictions or our brokenness. So thank you for letting me share. God bless you all.